Hier ist Libertär, das ganze Ding wieder auf dem Bermudafunk. Und heute machen wir mal was ganz Spezielles. Und zwar habt ihr leider nur das Audio, weil wir ja auf dem Radio sind und nicht das Video. Ich mache ein kleines freies Gespräch, also kein großes Interview mit dem David Rovics. Es ist ein Songwriter und politischer Aktivist aus den USA, der hier auch schon in Deutschland war, momentan nicht auftreten kann und sich seine Zeit damit vertreibt, äh, verschiedene politische Podcasts zu machen. Und jetzt spricht er mit mir. Und wenn ihr kein Englisch könnt, habt ihr leider Pech gehabt. So, David, I just told my listeners who you are, and if they don't know any English, it's not my fault.
That's good. That's excellent.
So I would not translate it for the Germans, but I think the most people will understand it.
Oh, that's great.
So, David, I'm very glad that we have the opportunity to talk each other over such a long distance. And first, I think just say something about your person, what you do normally, and what you do in that critical time now.
Yeah, normally I'm a touring singer-songwriter and mainly travel around Northern Europe and do concert tours and write songs and record them. And I've been doing podcasting for some years now. And since the pandemic hit, I've become a full-time broadcaster, basically hosting an online open mic and a interview show 4 days of the week, and still writing songs, but not touring anymore because obvious reasons.
Oh, and you're do you call yourself an anarchist? Would you say that?
Yeah, I would. I just I do call myself an anarchist, and I also rarely introduce myself as an anarchist because I'd rather people understand my political perspective from more detailed presentation than just the word, which most people don't understand what it means anyway. So it's
I had the same problems for a lot of years because a lot of people don't know what anarchism is. Most people think anarchism is my teacher told me anarchism is if you go over the street when the traffic light is red.
Yeah, right.
That is anarchism. And people think anarchism is totally chaos, but I think it's the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think crossing when the light is red, especially in the German context, is a very dangerous thing to do. You're endangering people around you. And I learned very early because I grew up in the New York area, and everybody jaywalks, nobody pays attention to the lights. And just like in England, and it's very dangerous, and people die because of that. And I don't know why people, have such disregard for their own lives in places like England and New York. But here on the West Coast, people don't jaywalk, and in Germany, people don't jaywalk. And it's these weird little things that have cultural differences. I don't know exactly how they all come about. I think it's, to some degree you can make sense of it, but it's, some parts of the world, people cross the road and risk their lives, and other places they don't. And in Germany, of course, they don't. And so if you do cross the road like a New Yorker, you're really you're endangering people around you, because they will cross the road. They will follow you across the road, assuming the light has changed because you're crossing the road, and they will not see that the light is still red. And I have nearly gotten Germans and Danes injured or killed by my jaywalking when I first was there, and I stopped. And I stopped, because I care about other people, and that's and if you care about other people, whatever your political philosophy is, you don't jaywalk in Germany. But that's but if you don't care about other people, you do jaywalk, and so it's a really a very, I think, wrong idea to have about anarchists. So very, very common kind of misconception that to be an anarchist means to be an individualist who doesn't care about other people. No, that's not anarchism, and I don't think it's, except in the minds of, teachers who don't like anarchism.
I think the problem is that anarchism is not an ideologic thing like communism, where you think, okay, that's how society should be. So for me, anarchism is the method. It's how you organize society. And
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think if you're an anarchist, you say you don't know how the best society is, but how we can come to that and how we organize it. So I bought a T-shirt from an American writer. I haven't I forgot the name, but I think you know it. And it's anarchism is taking democracy serious.
yeah, yeah, absolutely,
And that,
sure.
I think it's really the thing that's the core of anarchism. And I think a lot of people think about are anarchists, but they don't know it because they
Yeah,
think anarchism is chaos. And so I think
yeah.
for me, in former times, I always say, "Oh, I don't want to talk about my political thing." But now I think I'm an anarchist, and I think times changes, and anarchism is not so
Taboo, or is
yeah,
it's not.
it's not
Yeah,
so taboo like in former times. Do you have the same
yeah.
experience?
Yeah, absolutely. It's much more something that people are talking about and taking seriously as a concept. And I would say the same is certainly true of socialism as well, which here in the United States especially has been basically taboo since the 1950s at least, and it's really people are now talking about socialism and to some extent anarchism in serious circles, and in to some extent in the corporate media, not completely dismissing these ideas. And also, there's a lot more talk about how undemocratic this supposed democracy is, and how what would real democracy look like. It's actually to some extent being talked about now in on a more widespread basis in the U.S. Like the fact that democracy here began as something a privilege only for rich white men who were citizens, and a very very limited percentage of the population, and it's still if it's still a democracy really for the rich. It's changed its forms a bit, and it appears to be open to more participation, but it's very much a rule of the rich situation. And of course, we're such a long way from any kind of social democracy, let alone any kind of real full democracy that we might call anarchism. But uh, yeah, at this point in this country, social democracy would be a massive step forward.
Yes, I also think we have to go little steps. And I think the problem here also in Germany is most people say, I don't want to be involved in politics. They always say, "Oh, the politicians are all bad." And I'd say, okay, if the politicians are all bad, then do it better, do something. And they just say, Mrs. Merkel is bad, or I don't know. And I think if you're not do something better, you don't have the right to be against these politicians, because you can exchange them. But what I think it's little things. If you don't buy plastic bags, or if you don't buy big cars, or any, but these little steps most people don't go. But they can do something, and I think perhaps it's a chance in these academic times that people more think about. these little step? Do you think?
I mean, I would say that nothing wrong with taking those little steps, and it's also important to do to set an example for how you can live better. But I think that what's really important is that people realize that in addition to participating in the democratic process to whatever extent it exists in your country, and I'd say in Germany, I would be much more excited about participating in the democratic process than here, because the democracy we have is extremely primitive. You know, this two-party state that basically has no capacity to be anything more than a two-party state. And both parties are the same basically in terms of like they're all run by, it's basically mostly rich people in the Congress, and the Democrats are actually even richer than the Republicans on average, just by a little bit.
Okay.
But at $4,000 net worth richer than the Republicans on average. You know, just I mean, it's just worth noting because most people would assume it would be the other way. It's not.
Mhm.
But I think what's really important is that people realize that here and around the world, really, what really changes governments other than elections is direct action. And I think you have loads of great examples of direct action having a tremendous impact on government policy in recent German history, with the anti-nuclear movement and the squatting movement, to take two very important examples that are often, especially with the squatting movement, it's often derided in mainstream circles as just a bunch of privileged punks or whatever. But I think the squatting movement had a tremendous and very important impact on European society generally. That would be hard to overstate, and it had nothing to do with participating in democracy, and you know, in politics. You know.
Yeah, I'm original. I was born in Hamburg, and
The baby woke up,
wait,
but I'm still here.
I was. If there is something with the baby and you have to finish, it's okay. Then
No, I don't have to finish. I think her mom will come in and
okay.
take her, but she might wait until she starts making more noise. I'm not sure.
No, I was born in Hamburg, and now I'm living in the southern part of Germany, where you also been there in Besigheim nearby.
Right.
And I'm grown up in Hamburg, and there was the squatting thing about the Hafenstraße
Oh yeah, Hafenstrasse.
and
Yeah.
and the Rote Flora. And this is really a strong movement, and they are now in that houses since the 1980s, and they really defend it. And I think they have got my honor to do that.
Yeah.
I'm not the fighting one, but I think that's great. I'm just more filming.
Yeah, no, there's so many different important roles to play in any kind of struggle, but yeah, I mean, just holding on to the buildings like Hafenstrasse and keeping them occupied, and keeping the defenses, you know, building the barricades. I mean, you know, you don't have to be one of the ones throwing things at the police. There's a lot of other important ways to participate, not to downplay that role, which is, I think, also important in many situations. But I mean, the housing policies in places like Germany, who knows how bad things might have gotten at this point in terms of neoliberalism and austerity budgets. You know, I mean, I know things are going in the wrong direction with Merkel and her policies around the CDU policies around deregulating the housing market and allowing it for more market rate housing in places like Berlin. But I mean, it's a big struggle in Germany, of course, and I know the city of Berlin has recently made some great advances in terms of reversing some of that bad housing policy, but by buying back hundreds of thousands of apartments, if I recall. I don't remember the numbers, but it was some massive thing that just happened in Berlin around housing. But I think we can thank the squatters for making the issue of housing still something that is really struggled over, and to a large extent, you know, it's been a real victory. I mean, housing in many European countries, including Germany, is still for the most part, affordable.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's not something we can take for granted, but the situation is so much better there, I think, because of those kinds of social movements. That's part of why it's better.
Yeah, and I think it's also in Hamburg, in St. Pauli, and that's yeah, it's
Yeah,
a place where a lot of clubs, venues are, and a lot of poor people live in, and it's the heart of Hamburg, and you could a few years ago you could live there for cheap money. Now all the advertisement agencies and the extraction of the harbor and so and Hamburg, world city and so on.
yeah,
And
it's changed a lot for the
yeah,
worse, for
and
sure.
I'm very sad because it's my hometown that
Yeah,
these old St. Pauli with the little clubs, and also because of Corona, these little clubs are dying, and
yeah,
I hope that the government they just support the big ones, the the car sellers, Mercedes, BMW, the Lufthansa, and so they get the money. And I think the little clubs and the little
yeah.
shops,
They're looking at going out of business, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah, and I've also heard about this happening in Belgium and the Netherlands, that they're bailing out the big companies, but the little clubs are at risk of going out of business. Here in the United States, I think that there is an estimate from some restaurant association person I heard on the radio that 85% of restaurants in the US are probably going to go out of business.
oh, oh. And the other topic that many German people are also afraid of is how it's going on in the US with the politics, with this fucking guy Trump. A lot of people in Germany don't understand why people voted him. They don't, and why now, because of his behavior and what he's done, are still there people that are in favor of him. And I also don't understand this. I don't damn all the people in America, because I know there are a lot of people like you that are opposed to it, but I couldn't understand the other ones.
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's worth noting that Trump actually lost the election in terms of the popular vote. He lost by 3 million votes, even though the opponent was the weakest possible imperialist neoliberal the Democratic Party could have offered, aside from Joe Biden. You know, so but yeah, and but yeah, I think it's in order to understand the situation in the US today, I think that you really, it helps a lot to have a familiarity with early 20th century German history, because I think that we are in 1933 here in the US. And it's not that history is going to repeat, and it's not that, everything's going to turn out the same. We don't know what's going to happen next
Mm,
year. But the question of whether there's going to be an election in November
mm.
is a very real question.
If there is really an election, and so you think Trump is a little bit like Hitler with the Ermächtigungsgesetz. I don't know the English word. That
Like disregarding all the basic laws of the
yeah,
country, and
yeah,
disregarding Supreme Court judgments, and appointing people to head departments who never get vetted by the Congress, who are never actually appointed, or there's a process for appointing heads of federal departments, and he's just ignoring this process and appointing what they call acting heads. So they are just totally political appointees that have not been approved by the Congress, and have no. I mean, as bad as the Congress is, and as bad as both parties are, he is just completely circumventing all the normal political processes and disregarding court judgments. I mean, these children that have been taken from their parents, these thousands and thousands of children that have been taken from their parents at the border, many of them now for years, they still have not been returned to their parents. And even though courts have ordered the government to return the children to their parents, the first ruling telling them to do that, I can't remember, was like a year ago or something. And now the courts have once again told the government to return the children and given them a deadline of 3 weeks to do it. But I mean, I don't think anybody even knows how many children we're talking about. The records were not kept, and that's also not government policy. They're supposed to keep records. They're destroying records. It's really, it's really, and they're talking about. Trump is constantly talking about how this is going to be the most corrupt election ever, and we can't trust the outcome of the election if there's going to be an election. And also, the postal service is falling apart because it's totally underfunded and understaffed, and the big bailouts did not include the postal service. And if there's going to be an election in November, it will have to be done by mail to be done safely during a pandemic like this, which is an out of control pandemic in much of this country right now. And if there's not a functioning postal service because the government destroys it by not funding it, I mean, there's a lot of ways he can manage to have some kind of supposed, apparently legitimate excuse to cancel the election. I don't know if it's going to happen, but these, I think, at this point are real questions, and it's too early to tell, what's going to happen. But I mean, with the protests that have been happening over the past few weeks, I mean, Trump has he has done his absolute best to make them as big as possible and as violent as possible. He has, through policy and through his words, done his best to pour fuel on the fires. And you know, it's he's trying to start a civil war, and he's not succeeding. But whether he will succeed is an open question, because we have lots of brown shirts, and they're not very well organized, and it's not a big movement compared to in the 30s in Germany. I think on either side, whether either the left or the right, they're both on the streets. There's nothing to compare to the level of organization of either the left or the right in the 30s in Germany, in the early 30s. But the dynamic is there.
And the problem, I think, it's worldwide. More and more leaders are acting like dictators. They are democratic elected, like
Yeah.
Trump, like Putin, like Orban, and all the other ones.
And I
And
think very notably Modi in India and Bolsonaro in Brazil. I mean, to take two very big countries. Yeah.
and I think this is yes, as you said, in the 30s and the 20th century in Germany, um, the democracy is going down, and the old nationalism and dictatorship is coming back. And I think all the people that are against that, we have to really unite and do something against it. Also in Germany, the ones that say Mrs. Merkel is shit, that are mostly the right ones. Mrs. Merkel is not the best politician, and so, but in comparison to the other ones,
Mm-hmm.
she tries to do something. She tries to do for the refugees and so on. She's not so bad, but a lot of people, and that's the problem, that are like Trump. You couldn't talk to them in a rational way, because they are dogmatic, and they
And they
don't.
get all their information from like basically fake news sources.
Yeah, and that's the
Yeah.
problem. But I think there are a lot of people that don't want this, but we have to unite. And it's also in the left in Germany. They quarrel against each other, little groups, and I think it's more important to see what unite us than what separate us. So
Yeah, absolutely. A unity on the left would be. It's a nice fantasy, and of course it needs to happen. But it's also, I think, it's important to also call out the sort of the center left for their complete inability to rise to the occasion, because if they don't, if the Social Democrats or here the Democratic Party, if they're not able to rule in a way that it, that allows the working class to eat and have a decent life, if they are too scared of the rich and powerful, or too controlled by the rich and powerful to be able to uh, do anything that will prevent the rise of fascism, then I think we cannot blame the far left. We can't blame the communists or anarchists for the inability to prevent fascism if the Social Democrats themselves or the Democratic Party here is unable to reverse the trend of increasing stratification of wealth. Because like what you see under this, for example, the past 8 years of the Obama administration, during those 8 years, that we had this really nice looking, friendly, eloquent, uh, brilliant orator, brilliant person in the White House. He was ruling over the uh, a terrible, terrible economic situation. Of course, he inherited a terrible economic situation, and then he made it worse. His administration made it worse. The Goldman Sachs bankers that made up his cabinet, they just continued the same policies of the bailout of the rich that began under the Bush administration. And continued many of the same imperial policies that began under the Bush administration or before the Bush administration, and continued the funding of the military to the tune of $700 billion a year. And of course, we got health care out of the deal. Many of us did. But during those 8 years, throughout this country, especially in certain parts of the country, the cost of housing doubled. So that's and that's what people will remember. That's whether they understand what all the dynamics involved were or not. What people understand clearly from their own personal experiences is that they got poorer and life got harder under Democratic rule, and the same thing happened last time there was a Democrat in power. Although they say the economy was booming in the 90s, it was only booming for people that had lots of stocks. For the working class, things were just getting worse under those 8 years of Bill Clinton. So, and not that things improved under Republicans, they got worse under Republicans too. But what the working class here has been experiencing for the past 50 years or so has been just a constant decline in real wages, and a constant decline in the quality of life, and now actual decline in longevity. We are now living less long than we used to. So maybe not as dramatic as Russia in the 90s, but it is a very dramatic falling apart of society. And when society falls apart, people look for more radical solutions, and the radical solutions that are available do not include the left. I mean, the left and the anarchist movement, and this kind of element has been so locked out of any kind of we just, the way the police behave. I mean, how the police beat the shit out of Occupy Wall Street all over the country. It was amazing that it lasted as long as it did with that much police brutality going on. And you look at the police brutality happening all over the country now. I mean, the system makes sure that the options are very limited, and the options in terms of what appear to be radical solutions that were available, at least conceivably, were being led by Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And the Democratic Party did everything possible to sabotage Bernie Sanders, both in 2016 and in 2020. So they have handed us Donald Trump.
Yes, I think Bernie Sanders would be a opportunity, or especially for the young people that support him. I think them making politics, or making your life as an anarchist. I think it's very hard, because I'm an anarchist, but I know we don't have that system, so we have to deal with a faulty system, and we have to act in this, and we have to make um, no we have make unities with people we don't like, because we have to fight against fascism, and on the other side we have to stay to our very own opinion. And I think um, the only way is to really change the system, because if we don't change the system, nothing will change. But that's too much for a lot of people. But I think uh, for me, it's not a democracy, because you can choose between in your case, between Democrats and Republicans, and they say, "Oh, we have a democracy," but you couldn't say what they do, and if they do something wrong, you couldn't say, "Now we get you out of the office." So I think we have to control more in these so-called democracy, and on the other side, all the anarchists have to unite and make the other culture. So DIY venues, or repair shops, or so things, so that we are a little bit independent from these democratic structures.
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. I mean, we need to do as much as possible. We need to be creating alternatives, alternative models for living and for surviving and for education and for all sorts of different ways. Alternative presses, alternative everything. You know, we need lots of alternative structures that are not part of the capitalist system. But at the same time, I think also, and I think I agree that, like, at the same time as people are involved with such projects, people can also go to the, to vote once a year or whatever, twice a year, whatever it is. It's not going to kill you. But most importantly, I think we need to realize that reforms happen not because of which party gets elected most of the time, but because of events that are taking place on the streets in the real world. And the fact that you're hearing both leaders of both parties at local and state and federal level all over this country talking every day about racism, institutional racism, police brutality, the budget for the police, whether we have enough social services in a city, and talking about these things. This is entirely the result of widespread protests that have taken the streets, and it is the fact that the protests have been widespread and going on for a month and have taken streets and bridges every day that has been what's been so effective about the protests, and it's also what has brought down so much police brutality. Is just what they call peacefully, or what any sensible person would call peacefully taking the streets. Marching down the street here in this country is considered to be an action that warrants violent police repression. And that also, I think, in case people don't understand what's going on here, the police are attacking people for marching down the streets. The police are attacking people for doing what, in at least from my experience, generally in places like Denmark, will result in a police escort to keep traffic in order and prevent accidents. What happens here is the police as soon as people are in the street, start attacking them with tear gas, rubber-coated steel bullets, batons, uh, tasers, and sound weapons. And then these provoked attacks by the police are causing a lot of people who had no plan to necessarily smash windows or burn stores. This people get angry, and I've seen the same thing happen in many different countries, including in Germany, incidentally, where when the police attack people who had no plan to have a riot, the people will riot. And like in Rostock in 2007, it was quite remarkable at the G8 protests. The people who actually started smashing the cobblestones in the streets of Rostock and throwing them at the police were not the Black Bloc. And I don't know how many people were there or no. It was kids that had no intention of fighting with the police, and they were attacked by the police. And I don't know exactly who started it or why the police started attacking everybody, but it was collective punishment on the part of the police. And it was maybe somebody threw something at them. I don't know. I didn't see that. But what I did see was massive numbers of police just descending on the crowd of marchers. And what was interesting about it at the time was seeing that people were fighting back because they were being attacked, and it was actually the Black Bloc at the time. The autonomous bloc had no plans to fight with the police. They had already agreed that this was going to be a day where they don't do that. This is like the family-friendly march. But you can't have a family-friendly march when you don't know what the police are going to do. And if that's true, much more true here than it is in Germany, but it's true in anywhere where there's a big event taking place. It tends to be, at least in the countries that I'm familiar with, the police are just going to attack people for taking the streets if in many different situations.
I think it's very difficult, especially in the US, where we don't understand that the police act like that. If there is really nothing, and they kill people. I've been on lots of demonstration here in Germany, and I experienced both things. I experienced police. We have got anti-fascist demonstration at the 1st of May. It was in 2011, and we don't do anything, and they put us in a place for about 8 hours where it was really heat, really a hot day. And they arrested people and with no just for fun. And on the other way, I was on the big anarchist demo in Frankfurt against the
bank, the big
bank,
central bank,
yeah,
Blockupy.
And I think some people, and I think violence is okay if you're attacked, and but some kids I don't understand. And there was a demonstration, and there were kids and mothers with their children, and they threw stones into the windows, and there was no police, and they know it because the police know that somebody will do that, and so we don't reach our aim. And some think of violence from protesters, but these are not people that think political. They just want to have their fun, and
and this is happening. And I don't know exactly what motivates some people to do some things, but what's the important point is the way the police engage in collective punishment after this kind of thing happens, and the way they facilitate this by not being there. As you described, the police were not there. They had left the scene. They were inviting this. They knew that there would be some people engaging in such activity. And here, all over the country, you find that when people start torching buildings and breaking windows, the police are absent. And then later on they come when there's fewer people out, and they start attacking and mopping up or whatever. But they just allow this kind of thing to happen, and it's not that so many people are necessarily engaging in window breaking and burning, that the police would have much trouble controlling the
Mm,
situation. But they love it when people start smashing things, you know. And I'm not saying it's wrong to smash police stations and take them over. I love the fact that the police station in Minneapolis was burned to the ground and that people moved into it. And I love the fact that the police retreated in Seattle and that people took over the police station in Seattle. That's wonderful. But the authorities, the police, the politicians love it when windows are smashed because they can make themselves look good and look like defenders of law and order, and they can make the potential for a far right takeover more popular among some elements of the population who are scared of black people and scared of protests and scared of anarchists and watch Fox News and believe everything they're told. Or maybe they've even had bad experiences when they went into the city at some point, and when they're younger maybe they got mugged at gunpoint, you know, and whatever happened to them, and then they watch Fox News, and it's a whole combination of things that creates this kind of mindset. And there is real violence in society, and there is a real problem with all sorts of violence and crime and you know. But as any sensible person knows, the solution to crimes, which are largely, when you look at it, crimes of poverty, the solution is to end poverty, you know. But of course, that's not here in the U.S. That's never been a consensus around that idea, you know, and you know, around this sort of basic idea that most people in most social democratic type countries just take for granted, that of course, if you're going to have poverty, you're going to have crime. And if you don't want to have crime, you need to end poverty. Everybody understands that as sort of an obvious statement in places like Norway or Denmark. But here it's a very controversial concept. And there, of course, the far right, and well, not just the far right, but many people in society believe that the solution to crime is punishment.
mm. Yes. Okay. We've talked a lot about politics, and I think it's very important. And I like your opinions, and I think we have to go on, and we have to do what we could do as a person and with our friends. And I enjoy talking to you, and hope we will continue this for a while. And at the end, I just want to talk about your music with
Hmm.
you,
Yeah.
because I'm interested in that also, because I'm also doing music, and I just saw your broadcast about songwriting, and I saw myself a little bit in that. So ex- and that's, I think, that what's very important for people to experience things, to have time to do that, because a lot of kids, because in the school they don't have the time. And I also uh, I put my guitar and have some chords, or I have something I'm angry about, and then it comes to your mind, and you write a text. And in my case, it's so mostly there's first the text, and then I create some chords. Or I just want to say, asked how, what is the music for you? Is it just a living, or is this mainly to express yourself and your opinion?
Well, it's definitely started out as a passion and still is for just I love music and I love writing and I think it's a great way to communicate. Songs are a great way to communicate and very powerful medium of communication. And music is really good for my emotional and mental health and other people's emotional and mental health. Good for community building. Good for a lot of things. You know, I guess when you're a teenager and you start playing the guitar, you think, one reason might be that you hope it might attract companionship. It's good for that too. It's good for a lot of things. I mean, but music is just is part of our blood. It's part of our. It's. I mean, we have rhythm from the time our hearts start beating, and we can sing as soon as we can make noises with our vocal cords. It's just intrinsic to who we are, and has been for I think we can say for sure has been for tens of thousands of years, if not longer. It's there's good evidence that we've been playing music at least for the past 60,000 years or longer. Um, but it's but certainly it's also how I make a living. And I used to work other jobs like that I really didn't like. I've never had a job that I liked other than playing music, but certainly working other jobs and having to make a living and pay the rent doing things I didn't like to do was very inspiring to make me try to take the whole business angle seriously and as a musician, not just play music for fun, because I do have to eat and pay the rent and all that stuff, and now support my family and other things. So I've been making a living at it for a long time too, and since the 90s. And it was a lot easier to make a living as a musician in the 90s, I can say for sure. But it's still possible to make a living as a musician even during the pandemic. But even without any gigs. Uh, but it is certainly a very different business model from the way that it used to be, or the way touring used to be. It I mean, in because the way before the pandemic, the music industry collapsed. Because of the lack of merch sales. Everything's free online, and that has a lot of good things about it. But in terms of making a living, it's made it a lot harder for a lot of people. And even just to have money to record a good album, it just became it used to be you recorded an album, and then even if you spent many thousands of dollars on it, it was like no big deal, because you knew that you'd make that up in the first few hundred CDs that you sold, and then after that you'd be paying the rent. And then and I used to always sell a few thousand CDs every year, touring around playing 100 gigs or 150 gigs or whatever. But that's that stopped happening, and then at the same time as that stopped happening, the rent doubled. And then so but it's still possible, but certainly a lot fewer people actually, like on tax forms, like in census data, you find that there's like something like half as many people now as 20 years ago who claim to be professional musicians. And it's not that there's fewer musicians, it's just that there's way fewer of them actually surviving at it.
And I think I- what I'm really sad about is that most people that listen to music, they just listen to punk, or just listen to folk, or just listen to electronics, and they listen always to the same kinds of stuff, and not influenced by another styles, and the that ones could not do with that ones, and so on. And I think um the music, for me, it's really to express myself, to my political opinions, my also to deal with my mental health. And I would wish if a lot of people they dare to write songs, because people say, "Oh, I couldn't do this." And I say, I just have some chords and some lyrics, and try it. It must not be perfect." And a lot of people always think it always have to be perfect. And so
Hmm.
uh, I think making music, um, everyone could do it in his own way. And okay, if you're doing it professional, it's another way. But um, if we make music, it's the people come together,
Yeah.
and not just the music that the big bands like the Rolling Stones tour over 40 years and do the same stuff, and so on. And there's nothing new, and there are so little bands here also in Germany. that don't have the money. They but they make really great creative music. So
Yeah,
and
definitely.
so
Yeah.
so that's a little bit sad, I think.
But it is, yeah, it's true that, I mean, I think also when you look at the history of music and the music industry, it seems that basically every time things get really, really stiflingly boring and predictable and formulaic in the music industry, and oftentimes really high tech, very high technical quality, but no real spirit.
Mm,
And then inevitably things come out of the grassroots to challenge that and to blow it all apart. And I think that you'll that happened with rock music, with the folk revival, and with punk, and with rap. I mean, in hip hop, it's the same phenomenon with many different styles of music that became sometimes very popular, or at least had a big influence. But it was this all of them, all of these new styles that of course became more or less establishment to some extent, but basically these new styles, they all have in common this idea that everybody can do it, that it's just like three chords and the truth, that
yeah.
you just need something to beat a drum and then make up poetry, and you got it. You just need a guitar and that's it. It's very low, low qualifications, and then of course these styles of music sometimes become very, also they change, and they get more technical and more professional quality in different ways. But the idea of everybody being able to do it, and everybody participating, and music being a community thing and not being a mystery, because anybody can do it, and then also anybody can get really good at it. I mean, and there are differences between really good musicians and not so good musicians who maybe just got started or never really took it that seriously. I mean, everybody should play anyway because it's good for them and it's good for their community. But it's also like, I would say you can be somewhat objective in terms of like, if you're a good songwriter, if you write a good funny song, people will laugh when you sing it.
Mm.
If they don't laugh, it's not funny. you know so there is some objective. If you write a song about a story that's really sad, and the main character dies in the end, there should be people crying. And even in Germany, they might not be crying loudly, but you should hear some sniffling. Somebody should be getting out their handkerchief, and and then you wrote a good sad song. And I say in Germany because I actually, as a touring artist, I had to learn how to change your expectations depending on what culture you're in, because like in Northern Europe, people do not react loudly to things the way they do in many other countries, like in the US or in Southern Europe. Like, people don't shout as much in the audience, but you learned what enthusiasm means. Sustained applause, that means they really liked you. They don't have to shout after the verses they like. In fact, if anybody does that, somebody's going to look at them like, what's your problem? But it depends on the subculture too. But it's not to generalize too much, but there are definitely differences. Like the first time I was touring anywhere in Northern Europe, I was like, whoa, they all hate me. And then at the end of the show, oh, they just bought 20 CDs, I guess they didn't hate me. But you sort of, you figure it out.
Okay, David. Was nice talking to you, and
Yeah.
I learned a lot about politics and about music, and it really connects both of us, because that are our favorite themes. And I hope we stay in touch and talk some. Um, oh, my English is my
Again.
talk again.
You're only self-conscious about it because you're talking with me, and we're broadcasting.
It doesn't matter. I'm working for community radio, and I don't have to be a professional.
That's right. But the way you introduced when you said that people can either understand English or it's their tough luck, it reminded me of one time I was driving across South Dakota, and at that time, before satellite radio and the internet, there was only one radio station in this huge area called the Badlands. You could only get in one radio station, and it was in the Lakota language. And so in this radio program I was listening to for hours, this was this old Lakota man, and everything he said was in Lakota, except that every 20 minutes he'd start speaking English, and he'd say, "What's the matter? You don't understand your own language? If you don't understand your own language, then you should learn it." And then he'd switch back to Lakota. It was just very funny. Yeah.
Okay, David.
Yeah.
Then have a nice time, and I hope your baby will sleep soon. And then we stay in touch. And
Yeah,
thanks
good.
for